September 1928. Alexander Fleming walks back into his London laboratory after a 2-week vacation and finds a mess he left behind. Stacked petri dishes, bacterial cultures he never bothered to clean up. One dish has mold growing in it, and around that mold, something strange. A perfect circle where the bacteria are just gone. That contaminated dish probably should have been thrown in the trash. Instead, it became the most important accident in medical history. A story of how penicillin was discovered, and how the man who found it tried to warn us about what would happen if we misused it. We didn't take him seriously. This is Object Origins, the channel that traces the things we take for granted back to the moments that created them. Quick note before we get into this, I'm not a medical professional. Nothing here is health advice. This is a history, and it's one worth knowing because the story of the Alexander Fleming discovery doesn't end where most people think it does. It ends with a warning. And that warning is becoming our reality right now. Fleming was a bacteriologist at St. Mary's Hospital in London, a skilled researcher, but not exactly meticulous about tidiness. Before leaving for his summer holiday in August 1928, he stacked several petri dishes containing Staphylococcus bacteria on his bench and walked out. He didn't seal them, he didn't store them, he just left. While he was gone, something happened that required a chain of small coincidences no one could have engineered. A mold spore, likely drifting from a mycology lab 1 floor below, landed on one of those open dishes. London had a brief cold snap that week, cool enough for the mold to grow, but too cool for the bacteria to multiply aggressively. Then, the temperature rose again. The bacteria resumed growing, everywhere except in a ring around the mold. When Fleming returned on September 3rd, he noticed the anomaly. He reportedly showed it to a colleague and said, "That's funny. Not Eureka." Not a grand declaration, just, "That's funny." He identified the mold as Penicillium notatum and found that it produced a substance capable of killing multiple types of harmful bacteria. He called that substance penicillin. He published a paper in 1929 in the British Journal of Experimental Pathology. And then, essentially, nothing happened. This is the part of the history of penicillin that tends to get skipped. Fleming published his findings, and the medical world shrugged. His paper didn't generate significant follow-up research. No pharmaceutical company reached out. No headlines. Part of that was Fleming himself. He was a lab researcher, not a chemist. He couldn't figure out how to isolate penicillin in a stable, concentrated form. Every time he tried to purify it, it degraded. He eventually moved on to other work, and the paper sat largely unread for almost a decade. It's tempting to frame this as scientific negligence, brilliant discovery ignored by fools. But that oversimplifies it. In the late 1920s, the idea that a mold byproduct could safely treat infections in humans was genuinely difficult to take seriously. Sulfonamide drugs were beginning to show promise. Funding was scarce. And Fleming's own paper, while accurate, didn't make a dramatic case for penicillin's clinical potential. The discovery was real, but it was incomplete. And incomplete discoveries get forgotten all the time. For 10 years, the greatest medical discovery of the 20th century sat in a journal that almost nobody was reading. In 1938, 2 researchers at the University of Oxford, Howard Florey, an Australian pathologist, and Ernst Boris Chain, a German-born biochemist who had fled Nazi Germany, stumbled across Fleming's old paper while searching for antibacterial substances. They decided to pick up where Fleming left off. Chain managed to do what Fleming couldn't: isolate penicillin in a stable form. By 1940, they had enough to test on mice infected with lethal doses of Streptococcus bacteria. The treated mice survived. The untreated mice didn't. But production was a nightmare. To treat a single human patient, Florey's team needed to grow penicillin in every available container: bedpans, milk churns, ceramic bathtubs. Their first human trial, in early 1941, involved a policeman named Albert Alexander, who was dying of sepsis from a scratch. The penicillin worked. His fever dropped, his infections receded. Then they ran out. Alexander relapsed and died. Florey knew the drug could work. The problem was scale. Britain was being bombed nightly and had no industrial capacity to spare. So in the summer of 1941, Florey flew to the United States and eventually connected with a government research lab in Peoria, Illinois. The team there made 2 breakthroughs. They switched from surface growing to deep tank fermentation, massively increasing yield. And then came another stroke of absurd luck. A lab assistant brought in a rotting cantaloupe from a local market. The mold on that cantaloupe, a strain of Penicillium chrysogenum, produced 200 times more penicillin than Fleming's original mold. That single piece of garbage fruit became the ancestor of nearly all penicillin production that followed. By June 6, 1944, D-Day, the Allied forces had enough penicillin stockpiles to treat every wounded soldier who needed it. An accidental invention, ignored for a decade, rescued by 2 researchers and a rotten melon, had become the most powerful weapon against infection the world had ever seen. Estimates suggest penicillin saved lives numbering well over 200 million from the 1940s onward. In 1945, Fleming, Florey, and Chain shared the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. Fleming gave his Nobel lecture in December of that year, and he used part of it to issue a very specific warning. He described exactly how bacteria could develop resistance to penicillin, through exposure to doses too low to kill them. He warned that a day might come when penicillin could be bought over the counter, and that irresponsible use would breed resistant organisms. He was describing the future with uncomfortable precision. And the world moved on. Antibiotics became miracle drugs, prescribed for everything, including conditions they couldn't treat. They were added to livestock feed to promote growth. They were dispensed without prescriptions in large parts of the world, exactly the scenario Fleming described. Antibiotic resistance is now considered one of the most serious public health threats of the 21st century. Research published in The Lancet estimated that in 2019 alone, roughly 1.27 million deaths were directly attributable to antibiotic-resistant bacterial infections. More than HIV, more than malaria. The pipeline for new antibiotics has slowed dramatically because they're expensive to develop and not as profitable as drugs patients take for years. There's a pattern here that keeps repeating. A scientist sees a threat clearly, they say it plainly, and we collectively decide it's a problem for later. It started with a messy lab bench and a dish that should have been garbage. It survived a decade of silence, a world war, and a rotting cantaloupe in Illinois. Penicillin saved more lives than most of us can comprehend, and the man who found it stood on a stage in Stockholm in 1945 and told us exactly how we'd lose it. Worth keeping in mind, medical decisions should always involve your doctor, not a history channel. But the history itself is worth sitting with. If this one earned your time, a like helps it reach more people. And if you're not subscribed to Object Origins yet, there's more here worth finding.